For years, if not decades, the European Union has been discussing whether to expand the use of qualified majority voting, or QMV. Most decisions these days are made by QMV, but unanimity is still required for decisions on certain politically sensitive areas, and the increasingly frequent use of vetoes by more obstructionist member states has led to a widespread sense that the EU's voting process needs reform, at least before further member states are admitted. And, earlier this week, we got the first concrete step in this direction, when European Council President Antonio Costa suggested replacing unanimity with QMV for the first stage of accession negotiations, in what looked like an attempt to circumvent Hungary's veto and accelerate Ukraine's accession negotiations. So in this video, we're going to look at the long-standing debate over unanimity versus QMV, why Costa's proposal probably won't go anywhere, and why this doesn't mean the EU should give up on voting reform entirely. Never miss an episode and always feel in the loop by subscribing and ringing the bell. First, a bit of context. In short, there are basically two ways in which decisions can be made in the EU. Unanimity, which requires the consent of all member states, and what's known as qualified majority voting, or QMV, which requires at least 55% of member states, representing at least 65% of the EU population. In the EU's beginnings, most decisions required unanimity. The 1957 Treaty of Rome, which established the EU's predecessor, the European Economic Community, created the Council of Ministers as the main decision-making body, and explicitly laid down when the Council had to decide unanimously and when by a qualified majority. At this time, unanimity was the default, with only a few economic or market provisions subject to QMV. QMV was also defined differently to today. Back then, each member state was given a number of votes, with larger member states generally getting more votes, and QMV requiring 70% of those votes. This was a feature, not a bug of the European project. The hope was that unanimity would encourage compromise between member states and avoid smaller states being overridden by larger ones, which would ultimately erode their support for the EU. As the European Union expanded, however, unanimity became difficult to achieve, so QMV was gradually expanded. The Single European Act of 1986 marks a turning point by significantly reducing the scope of unanimity, while subsequent treaties further expanded QMV into new policy areas. At the same time, the previous system of QMV had become somewhat convoluted as more member states joined. So in 2014, under the Treaty of Lisbon, this system was replaced by the double majority system that we have now. While the shift favoured demographically larger member states, the system also included a safeguard. A blocking minority must consist of at least 4 council members, preventing a small group of big states from dominating. Today, around 80% of EU legislation is adopted through QMV, and certain procedural matters require only a simple majority of member states. Nonetheless, a handful of politically sensitive policy areas remain subject to unanimity, because they're seen to touch directly on national sovereignty. The most notable examples are common foreign and security policy, accession negotiations, EU citizenship, taxation, and EU finances. However, in the past couple of years, a number of European leaders have argued that QMV needs to be expanded yet further, arguing that unanimity is just too difficult in an organisation with 27 member states, and gives too much power to veto-wielding obstructionists. Between 2011 and 2025, vetoes blocked collective action at least 45 times, with 15 of these occurring since 2024. Hungary has wielded its veto most often, voting no 19 times, followed by Poland on 7. And this has contributed to the EU's geopolitical sluggishness. Viktor Orban, for instance, has used Hungary's veto to water down sanctions on Russia, delay Ukraine's accession negotiations, and pressure the rest of the EU to unblock funds withheld over Hungary's democratic backsliding. This highlights another problem with unanimity, in that member states can and do use their vetoes on otherwise uncontroversial issues to extract concessions from the EU in other areas. And there have been 2 recent developments that have made QMV even more attractive. First, the prospect of further enlargement. In short, the EU is currently engaged in accession negotiations with 6 candidate countries: Montenegro, Serbia, Albania, North Macedonia, Moldova, and Ukraine. Proponents of QMV argue that given unanimity is already difficult enough to achieve at the moment, QMV would need to be expanded before any new member states were admitted. Second, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The EU's architects knew that unanimity would make the EU somewhat sluggish, but thought that it was worth it to encourage compromise and consensus. This has sort of worked, but it also means the EU isn't well suited for war or geopolitical competition, which require quick and decisive action. In the face of Russian aggression and no guarantee of American protection, proponents of QMV argue that it's necessary if the EU wants to become a geopolitical actor. Anyway, this issue came to a head earlier on Monday, when Politico reported that European Council President Antonio Costa was proposing introducing QMV for opening negotiations with candidate countries, in this case, Ukraine and Moldova. At the moment, opening negotiations requires unanimity, but Costa's proposal would shift this to QMV while preserving unanimity for closing negotiations and actually letting new countries into the EU. This would allow the EU to temporarily circumvent Orban's veto on Ukraine's accession process, so that Ukraine would actually be ready to join the bloc if Orban loses power at next year's elections. Unfortunately for Costa, Politico reported on Wednesday that his plan was already falling apart. And this is essentially because there are basically two obvious ways of expanding QMV: a new EU treaty, or what's known as the Passerelle clause, which allows for changes to the EU's decision-making processes without a formal treaty change. While the Passerelle clause might be slightly easier, both still require unanimity, allowing obstructionist member states to veto any change that would undermine their veto. Orban is obviously the most notorious veto wielder, especially when it comes to Ukraine's accession, but there are actually lots of other member states who are wary of giving up their vetoes on accession procedures or anything else. Balkan countries, for instance, have tended to use their vetoes against candidate countries with whom they have outstanding disputes, and countries like France don't like the idea of being outvoted full stop. This all suggests that a meaningful expansion of QMV will require a grand compromise, rather than ad hoc mini-expansions like Costa is proposing. Broadly speaking, there are three ideas on the table. The first is a sort of negotiated expansion of QMV, but with safeguards to make it more palatable to veto-wielding member states. This could be via some sort of blocking minority, or an independent watchdog that could evaluate individual member states' objections to QMV decisions. The second is Macron's idea of a multi-speed Europe, which would allow the EU to accept new countries while preserving the decision-making abilities of a European core. The third and most radical idea is what's sometimes known as EU 2.0. In short, if all of these other plans get vetoed, the EU could just start again and create a new EU without obstructionist member states like Hungary. All of these ideas feel difficult or even far-fetched, but at the end of the day, voting reform is almost definitely required before further enlargement. So the EU will either have to do one of them or give up on Ukraine and the others ever joining the Union. Ultimately, we live in a world where growing geopolitical and economic issues like this are hitting the headlines every day. And while it's easy to sometimes feel overwhelmed, there are ways to stay sharp. And we know that the easiest way to do this is with Brilliant. That's because Brilliant teaches you by doing, using active learning techniques to train you in the principles behind otherwise complex subjects, and ensuring you actually understand what's going on. With their ever-growing collection of lessons in topics ranging from maths to science to AI, there's plenty to get you started. Not only does each lesson offer a comprehensive mix of engaging problems and competitive features, but Brilliant also helps you stay consistent, keeping you motivated and excited to learn every single day. Take their newly updated science courses, for example. Here you can learn how to build simple computers out of logic gates, or open your eyes to the world around you by solving puzzles with science. Each lesson will help you to develop your scientific intuition through visual, interactive problem solving that gets you hands-on with key concepts. Try Brilliant for free and start your learning journey today by visiting brilliant.org/TLDR, scanning the QR code on screen, or clicking the link in the description. By doing so, you'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription, and they'll know you came from us, which really helps us out.